Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to those around the world. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Louise Gardner. I am the Africa coordinator for the Sustainable Banking and Finance Network, and I have been the coordinator for the Sustainable Finance Instruments Working Group over the last few years. And today's Taxonomy Toolkit launch is the outcome of extensive work in the last 2 years working with members to understand developments in taxonomy development. So we're very pleased to be launching the toolkit today, and not only will you be finding out about how this toolkit works and can support regulators and banking associations and other key stakeholders in emerging markets, but you'll also be hearing from some fantastic speakers who have been part and parcel of this journey globally. And I think taxonomies are without a doubt one of the topics where there's been immense collaboration in terms of learning how these tools are developed and then how they are implemented in practice. And the journey continues. So we're going to be hearing from Mr. Ye Yanfei, who is the former Deputy Director General of the China National Administration of Financial Regulation, formerly the China Banking and Insurance Regulatory Commission, and China produced one of the first national green taxonomies. And then we'll be hearing from Ms. Beng Brazil as part of the panel discussion, Deputy Director at Banco Central Filipinas, the Central Bank of the Philippines, and they have produced the most recent taxonomy within the Sustainable Banking and Finance Network. And then we'll be hearing from our colleagues from GIZ and the Climate Bonds Initiative, who along with IFC and the World Bank Group have been very involved in numerous national taxonomy developments. But before we get started, and of course that panel session will be moderated by Ms. Fiona Stewart, who is the lead financial sector specialist, finance, competitiveness and innovation global practice at the World Bank Group, and a superb collaborator on all things taxonomy. So I'm very excited to hear her facilitation of the panel. But firstly, I want to invite Rong Zhang, our global coordinator of the Sustainable Banking and Finance Network, to kick us off with some opening remarks. Over to you, Rong.
Very much, Louise, and good morning, good evening, and good afternoon. On behalf of the SBFN Secretariat, I would like to welcome you all to the launch event of the SBFN Taxonomy Toolkits. And this is a very exciting moment for SBFN members and our partners. The toolkit launch is just 1 week after the launch of SBFN Global Progress Brief and the data portal in Washington during the World Bank Group and IMF spring meetings. And I would like to share a couple of key findings and trends in the brief which are relevant to the taxonomy. First, among the six member countries in the emerging market we assessed, 47 countries have launched a framework to promote capital flows toward green, social, and sustainability goals, including guidelines for the issuance of thematic bonds or loans. In particular, 24 countries reported that they have published or in the process to develop green or sustainability-focused taxonomies. Second, all the SBFN countries with sustainable finance taxonomies cover activities that contribute to climate mitigation, so all of them, and most of them, including activities for objectives such as the climate adaptation, pollution prevention, circular economy, and ecosystem. There's also a strong interest and emerging trends to address social activities, such as the poverty reduction and gender, with Georgia and Mexico leading the way with innovations on this front. And also blue economies, such as water and oceans, with Sri Lanka incorporate elements from the IFC's blue finance guidelines. And also SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, with Mongolia being the first country to issue a formal SDG-linked taxonomy as part of their national sustainable finance policy architecture. Third, the taxonomy issued by members increasingly include a specific requirement to apply environmental social safeguards, and this including do no secondary harm and minimum social safeguard criteria, as well as explicit requirement to adhere to the national environmental social regulations. And this trend reinforced the role of environmental social risk management as a critical element across all parts of the sustainable finance architecture. However, it has also raised new complexities around implementation and verification, for which IFC is supporting research and engagement to help address, having learned from our successful experience of 3 decades of implementing the IFC's performance standards. Fourth, these frameworks for sustainable finance instrument, including taxonomies, have enabled increased financing for sustainability. For example, the research revealed $759 billion in thematic bonds have been issued in 45 member countries as of 2023. And this is more than 90% of total issuance in emerging market. And the year-to-year increase from 2022 to 2023 is 25%. Last but not least, the key recommendation from the brief is to enhance the integration and harmonization of sustainable finance frameworks. Member experience confirmed the benefits of integrating sustainable finance frameworks, such as the taxonomies, with effective disclosure requirement to prevent greenwashing and scale up sustainable finance flows, and where possible to support comparability between frameworks across regions and globally. Even though all countries indicate a desire to support more harmonization at global level, there's still tremendous innovation underway, and it's critical that the taxonomies respond to local priorities and the maturity of local institutions. Consequently, the taxonomy toolkits, which we were launching today, is a critical and timely contribution to discussions around innovation and interoperability. It contains first, practical findings of unique approaches. Second, emerging common elements of taxonomies. And third, the guidance on the steps that countries can follow to strengthen the governance, design, implementation of the taxonomies. And importantly, practical ideas around levels of interoperability that can be used to guide a discussion going forward. I would like to take this opportunity to thank our members for your contribution to the toolkit over the past 2 years. Today's webinar has the theme of looking back and looking forward. It features experience of China, as Louise mentioned, as the first country to develop a national taxonomy for the financial sector, and the Philippines as the latest member country to launch a sustainability finance taxonomy. However, on the journey to develop the toolkits and other resources, we have benefited from tremendous leadership and generosity from multiple SBFN countries that have pioneered the taxonomy trend and actively share experience with other countries in the last 2 years. They include Bangladesh Bank, China National Administration of Financial Regulation, Financial Superintendents of Colombia, Indonesia Financial Service Authority OJK, Mongolia Sustainable Finance Association, National Bank of Georgia, South Africa's National Treasury and the Reserve Bank, Central Bank of Sri Lanka, Bank of Thailand, and the ASEAN Taxonomy Board. In particular, China, Mongolia, Colombia, and South Africa were featured as case studies, including video interviews in the GIZ e-learning on sustainable finance taxonomy launched in June last year in collaboration with SBFN. So we're very grateful for the extensive collaboration with the World Bank, IFC, IMF, GIZ, and the CBI colleagues. Some of them will speak on the panel today. Great to see them. Collaboration is critical to ensure that we work together, a common good practice, and quickly leverage the innovations across different countries. We hope that this toolkit can contribute to further alignment between national, regional, and international efforts. It's a result of learning from the past and moving to the future with a more harmonized and collaborative approach. So IFC and SBFN, in collaboration, our colleagues in the World Bank and IMF, and partners such as the GIZ and the CBI, looking forward to supporting our members with technical assistance and guidance, such as the toolkit. With that, I hand over back to Louise. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Rong. And now I have the pleasure of introducing the toolkit, which goes live today. This is the toolkit, is part of a series of toolkits that have been developed by SBFN in starting with our toolkit on developing national sustainable finance roadmaps. And they respond to very practical requests from our members. As Rong mentioned, we have, along with World Bank Group members, IMF, GIZ, CBI, been providing practical support to countries, particularly in emerging markets, for the last several years, and have been part of the journey as taxonomies have been developed. And this is a very new space for everybody. And there have been great innovations at country level. And we are learning each time as our member countries introduce new ways of designing and implementing their taxonomies. So what was needed was to bring together these innovations as they were happening and consolidate the various materials that we were using and refining to support members. And that could be used by staff within the World Bank Group and other organizations to provide consistent and high-level quality of support to countries. So this is the purpose of the toolkit. And the way that SBFN works is our members guide us in terms of how these materials need to be developed, and also the good practices and the common approaches that need to be designed. So as Rong mentioned, this draws on extensive engagement with our members, and it will be a living document. So it will be a living document that is available through the SBFN website and comprises a slide deck with numerous slides that will be added to and refined over time. And we will also be adding supporting materials such as case studies as we go. So a brief overview of what the toolkit contains. So we have 111 slides in the toolkit, so it's quite a lot. And we encourage you not to be overwhelmed by the length of the toolkit, but rather see this as something that you can dive into and explore particular topics. So there's so many dimensions to taxonomy development, and we've tried to touch on the most important ones and to provide an insight into the good practices that are emerging, as well as some of the challenges and the innovations that are emerging to address those challenges. And Rong, for instance, mentioned the management of environmental and social risks. I've also referred to as do no significant harm and the minimum social safeguards that are required, starting with the EU taxonomy and then incorporated very quickly into numerous other taxonomies. And so we're finding that there's a common language of the elements that need to be included in taxonomies, but many of these terms and concepts and tools are still evolving in how they are implemented in a practical way. So here we have two sections that I think might be interesting. Managing environmental and social risks, which gives some insights onto the different approaches and research done by IFC to support these efforts. And then working toward interoperability. We don't have the silver bullet. We don't have the final solution on what interoperability looks like. We do know that most of the countries that we've engaged with, if not all, are very interested in interoperability. But there is a deep consciousness that the innovations that are happening at country level are by necessity reflecting local conditions and local market maturity. So maturity may have to do with the types of investments that are possible in the market, the priorities in terms of sectors that can help with countries' alignment with the Paris Agreement and with the Sustainable Development Goals, what the national development plans are and their timetable, as well as the maturity of the financial institutions and other players in the market to incorporate taxonomies alongside guidelines for issuance of bonds and loans that have sustainability impacts. So we see tremendous interest in working towards interoperability, but also a desire to still explore the innovations that are coming out from different countries of varying levels of maturity, and also learning from very mature markets like the European Union, where they have done us a great service of moving very quickly and very far and providing a comprehensive set of requirements for the private sector in Europe, but also allowing us to learn from what has worked and what may have been more difficult in their particular approach. Then we also have emerging themes such as designing inclusive taxonomies. In the last several years, our members within the Sustainable Banking and Finance Network have alerted us that financial inclusion, social inclusion, accessibility for SMEs are critical topics in the area of sustainable finance. So how do we make sure that we design these tools and make them accessible? And for instance, one of the innovations that we're seeing is making requirements less onerous for SMEs, or adding criteria, social safeguard criteria, and impact aspirations that are more inclusive of different groups in society. So I'd like to, at this point, give some acknowledgements in the development of this taxonomy. So firstly, and it's great to have Makayo on the call today, we have benefited throughout the process through really great collaboration with GIZ, which is very active in numerous markets, supporting taxonomy development, but also supporting innovations across sustainable finance. And we decided to team up 2 years ago to make sure that we aligned our efforts and we're learning quickly from each other's experiences. And this has been a very fruitful collaboration. The first outcome of it was the excellent e-learning that GIZ published in June last year, which is now available in English, Spanish, and French, which provides a great introduction to the design of taxonomies comparing China, the EU, Colombia, and South Africa. And for that, our members from Colombia and South Africa were active in videos and contributing content. Then the co-chairs of our Sustainable Finance Instruments Working Group have also been instrumental in helping us move this topic forward and identify the critical issues that need to be resolved. So the working group is chaired by the Indonesia Financial Services Authority, which recently published their updated taxonomy, Sustainable Finance Taxonomy, and is now collaborating with the Ministry of Finance in Indonesia to move this forward in terms of regulation. The National Treasury of South Africa, and South Africa will assume the G20 presidency next year and are keen to advance the discussion on taxonomy interoperability. And then the Latin American Banking Federation, FELABAN, which have encouraged us to consider how do we make this usable for the banking sector. And then numerous members within the working group, the Sustainable Finance Instruments Working Group, who have provided comments on this toolkit, and we want to appreciate our thanks that you've taken the time to give us your feedback. The toolkit doesn't stand alone. It is part of a suite of products developed by the World Bank Group and GIZ to support these efforts, and we've looking at different dimensions. So the World Bank produced the guide on developing a national green taxonomy in June 2020, which has provided a really good foundation for the process that many countries are following, including making sure that there is robust stakeholder engagement, particularly with the users of taxonomies. And as a result, we've seen that taxonomy development often takes up to 2 years for the pioneers that started out on this journey. Fortunately, we're now seeing that from learning from other jurisdictions, the timeline is shortening to 1 year. And we're starting to see taxonomies coming out within a space of 6 months, but still the requirement to tailor taxonomies to national priorities and to engage with stakeholders is still essential in terms of their success. In May last year, as Rong mentioned, there was research by IFC and the Equator Principles Association, which looked at specifically the challenges around implementing or aligning with requirements to do no significant harm to other objectives, other environmental objectives in a taxonomy. This is quite a novel innovation of taxonomies. It is linked to the established practices in terms of environmental and social risk management in the financial sector, but it adds just an additional level of scrutiny and vigilance particularly once you have assurance providers verifying alignment with taxonomies. And so we wanted to see whether standards like the IFC performance standards and the Equator Principles Association support alignment with the do no significant harm criteria. And we found there was very strong alignment, as well as with the minimum social safeguards. So we're seeing minimum social safeguards around labor, human rights, and increasingly, particularly in ASEAN, benefits to communities and women. So this resource gives you some tools and concepts in terms of how can you start to leverage the existing practices of the financial sector to support alignment. Then we have the GIZ e-learning, which we've already spoken about. And we do see this as an essential foundational course for any regulator, particularly regulators, but it's also interesting to other stakeholders, but particularly regulators, agencies, and supervisory teams that will need to evaluate alignment with taxonomy and implement taxonomies in terms of regulations in the market. And then finally, we had a paper in September last year that was developed by staff of the IMF, the World Bank, OECD, and with input from the BIS, the Bank for International Settlements. And this was a collaboration to look at how to apply the G20 principles for sustainable finance alignment with a focus on climate change mitigation. And the G20 has, as part of their action plan, provided a set of principles that they deemed would improve the quality of alignment approaches. So alignment approaches are any frameworks that support the country to align their financial flows with the Paris Agreement and with the Sustainable Development Goals. And this document unpacks some of the important considerations in how that would happen in practice. Then very quickly, what is contained in the toolkit and how can you use it? So firstly, the toolkit is based on a comparison of 12 national taxonomies that had been issued during the period of this work. The Philippines is the most recent, and in our next version of the taxonomy, we will incorporate them in the next version of the toolkit, we will incorporate the Philippines. But currently we have 12 national taxonomies and 3 regional taxonomies that we did detailed comparison. What did we find? As of February 2024, and looking further in terms of desk research, we see that there are 47 sustainable finance taxonomies or lists of eligible activities that have been issued globally since 2012. 31 are national taxonomies issued by 20 countries, of which 60% are SBFN member countries. There's still a great deal of variation across these taxonomies, but a desire to move towards common principles. There's a trend towards increasing scope. All the countries we evaluated have taxonomies that look at climate change, but we are seeing broader interest in environmental topics, as well as social taxonomies and alignment with the Sustainable Development Goals. Implementation is still new, which means we don't have many countries that have made this mandatory or have extensive regulations to guide the market. Many are exploring what this could look like and what incentives can be provided. Taxonomies range in complexity. Some are more on the side of simple lists. Others are extremely detailed and have in-depth technical criteria that must be met in order to support alignment. A very complex example is the EU, where not only do they have technical criteria, they also have specific guidance on how to do no significant harm, which is extremely valuable, but also adds to the requirements that are needed for verification. Transition is exceptionally important as a topic, and we're seeing that there's a desire to keep the elements of green or social quite pure and strong within taxonomy. So how do we aspire to science-based criteria for labeling things as green and preventing greenwashing? And how do we aim for ambitious social impact? But at the same time, there's a realization that many sectors or companies might not already be in the position to be labeled as green. Therefore, there needs to be some way to support sectors and companies in their transition and enable finance to help them on their transition journey. Therefore, we're seeing traffic light systems, transition principles, and other mechanisms to support this phased approach. All taxonomies continue to evolve. We notice that it's becoming common practice to update and expand. Thailand issued their taxonomy last year and already in the process of updating that taxonomy. And one of the leading countries has been China, and we can see that there have been numerous taxonomies issued. And the toolkit contains details on that journey within China, both on the banking side and in terms of green bond issuance. And we'll hear more from Mr. Ye today. Emerging markets are particularly interested in how to ensure inclusivity, so the social side, so micro, small, and medium-scale enterprises, women-owned businesses, and vulnerable groups. How do we make sure that they're involved and that the taxonomy benefits them and includes them? And then as more and more countries issue taxonomies, there's a need for ongoing governance and maintenance of these frameworks. This is still taking shape. In the early stages, countries were focused on just simply designing their first taxonomies and learning within their institutions how taxonomies can be used. But very soon it becomes clear, once you have a taxonomy, there needs to be ongoing governance to support capacity building, to expand taxonomies, to check what's working, what's not working, and to find ways to make these more effective in achieving the ultimate goal, which is to support sustainable finance flows. So the toolkit provides some common definitions. None of this is new to many people in this space, but it provides a good basis for discussion and collaboration, because we have seen that there are differences in how people view taxonomies, and simply having some common principles and frameworks is what this toolkit sets out to do. It provides a little bit of granular data in terms of the spread of and growth of national, regional, and global taxonomies. And you can see that the issuance of national taxonomies has been one of the fastest growing areas. But we do see a lot of benefit in regional collaboration. And then, as you can see, the diversification of the topics that are covered. This slide is going to be difficult to update in the future. We're running out of space because of the number of taxonomies that have been issued. So it's likely we'll have to find innovative ways of representing this landscape. But this is what we see today. And you can see that the majority of national taxonomies are being issued in emerging markets. This is partly due to the fact that the European Union has a single taxonomy for the European Union. But we do see a lot of interest in emerging markets and great innovations. On the left-hand side, we felt it was important to remind people that there are international taxonomies that will continue to be used. The International Capital Market Association, they don't have a taxonomy in the green and social bond guidelines, but they do have a list of eligible activities, and that at a minimum is what is being used in the market for many issuances at the moment. So for issuers, for the private sector to move to using national taxonomies, we need to understand that they are also using the ICMA principles, they're using the climate bonds taxonomy, and they're responding to the MDB, multilateral development banks, that have introduced common principles for climate mitigation, climate finance. IFC has also introduced guidance on biodiversity and blue finance. So this is the context in which, for instance, a bank will be choosing which of these taxonomies and lists should they be aligning their efforts with. It's important to note that we, as a fundamental aspect of interoperability, we need to move towards how do we channel the global aspirations down to the regional, national, and industry level, and how do we make sure that we're consistent in how that is done. So this is huge potential to support alignment and efficiencies within markets, and we are moving in the right direction. And so we hope this toolkit will support that. Another crucial consideration is that taxonomies are part of a sustainable finance ecosystem. This is from a toolkit developed by the World Bank in 2021 in terms of the green finance ecosystem. There are different ways to map this ecosystem, but this is quite useful in terms of how a taxonomy relates to other ingredients and frameworks. And then we cataloged emerging common features. And again, there's no perfect way to map these, and there might be differences of opinion, but we have identified these elements that make it easier to compare taxonomies. So not all taxonomies will have all of these elements, but these provide a foundation for us to benchmark which have been included. And for instance, that we have common ways of defining environmental and social objectives versus principles, that we know the difference between whitelists and taxonomies that have very detailed technical criteria, as well as the option to use proxies for activities to make alignment more efficient. So proxies being labels and certifications at the market level. And then transition, how do you build transition into the implementation? How do you provide guidance or regulations for disclosure, which is the primary way in which taxonomies are implemented? And then incentives to promote adoption. We identified numerous use cases across the private sector, as well as public sector use cases. And these continue to emerge. But what is important for users and developers of taxonomies is to be clear on what are you trying to achieve with a taxonomy and ensure that the design of the taxonomy supports that goal. And then finally, the current evolution of taxonomies. We were very aware that this is a work in progress. Most countries are approaching taxonomies in a phased approach and plan to extend over time. It's still quite complex, particularly for new users, and there needs to be time given to the market to adjust. I think there has been an increased focus on the need for capacity building and pilot studies. That was one of the trends that came through, is a very effective strategy, particularly led by the regulator, is to conduct pilot studies with the market to see how this taxonomy works in practice and how can regulation be improved to make it easier. There's a diversity of approaches and features. We still believe that the innovation that is happening in different markets is extremely valuable and should be encouraged so that we can all learn from these practices. However, there are some areas where it'd be really useful to bring more harmonization and to be using new principles such as do no significant harm in a consistent way so that investors know what it involves, as well as service providers such as assurance providers and verifiers, who will need to understand what exactly does that mean for their role and what do they need to track. But it is the start of a journey, and we think that the pace is increasing. It's not diminishing. The countries that are now coming into taxonomy development, they don't have doubts about the value of taxonomies, but they would like to minimize pitfalls and speed up the process so that they can get going with implementation. And a quick reference to the G20 alignment principles. The G20 is playing this very supportive role in this convergence, but also allowing the differentiated approaches. And finally, the importance of taxonomy governance. This was definitely a key theme, that you can design a taxonomy, you can implement a taxonomy, but ultimately the success of that taxonomy is dependent on how sustainable finance is governed in your market. So thank you so much. I'm very much looking forward to the discussions. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Fiona to take us into the panel session. Fiona, over to you.
Thank you. I think we have a China presentation to start off, don't we, before we're coming into a discussion?
Absolutely right. Apologies.
We have a backward before we go forward.
We have a backward before we go forward. So yes,
exactly.
Thank you for that, Fiona. So let me just quickly share my screen and invite Mr. Ye, who is the former Deputy General of the China National Administration of Financial Regulation, has been a long-running partner and champion with SBFN. So Mr. Ye, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. It's my great honor to be here, and great congratulations to IFC. It's not so easy to get Indonesian standards for the green taxonomy. especially has initiated by the FC and World Bank Group. That's really a tough task to finish. So congratulations to all of you. That's great. As you know, China has its own green taxonomy. In 2013, at that time, there were no green taxonomy across the world. At the very beginning, we asked our other ministries like the Super Ministry of China, National Development and Reform Commission, asked them to develop some kind of green taxonomy for us. They said they are too busy, they have no such knowledge to develop. So as a regulator, we have to develop the green taxonomy by ourselves at that time. But in 2019, then the National Development and Reform Commission stood out and say that they would develop a uniform green taxonomy for all the ministries for China. So since then, we had the first version of the nationally uniform green taxonomy, and this year we have the second version of the green taxonomy, uniform green taxonomy. Before this year, I remember in 2021, Central Bank of China, the People's Bank of China, has had some cooperation with the European Commission, and they developed a common green taxonomy that which is used for example, if Chinese financial institutions is going to issue some bonds in the European market, they must use this common green taxonomy. But in China, we use our own green taxonomy. So each country, as Luis mentioned, that each country has their own priorities, has their own features, has their own conditions. So the long run, in the future, for the long run in the future, perhaps we have the uniform green taxonomy across all the countries. So we have the globally uniform green taxonomy. But for now, I guess each country has its own green taxonomy. That's natural, because each country has their own priorities. Even in different ministries, they have different priorities. I remember when we have our first green taxonomy by ourselves, we consulted with 19 ministries. Each ministry has their own priorities. They have their own classifications. We have to discuss with them one by one until all the ministries reach agreement. So that takes about 2 years, nearly not more than 1 year to reach agreement. So that's very important. So the compromise with other ministries. The second one is that because financial institution as a service sectors provide some service to the other to the industries, to the agriculture, and to the service sectors. They have to serve for the national strategies and national goals. So that is very important when we develop our own green taxonomy. We're looking into what the State Council, the Cabinet of Chinese government, want the financial sector to do. So, because the national priorities and national goals are what we should work for. Otherwise, your taxonomy would not be supported by the cabinet. I mean, in China, it's by the State Council. In addition, the stakeholders are very important. The stakeholders like the NGOs, mediums, international financial institutions are very, very important. So we also consulted with them about the issues. Like I remember when we developed our Chinese green taxonomy, we asked the Long what the FC's new idea about that. We have had a lot of talks on these issues. So green taxonomy is evolving. It's evolving, always in a journey. So don't expect there's one green taxonomy for all the people, for all the countries, for all the time. It's always evolving. That's the first point that I should emphasize. The second one is that how to implement green taxonomy. The first thing is very important to have some have full exchange with the financial institutions, the banks. When you design the green taxonomy, during the process of designing the green taxonomy, we had a lot of discussion with the banks and the other stakeholders. It's very important. Without their consensus, without support, it's difficult to implement. So that's the first important. Full exchange with them. The second one is capacity building. We have a lot of training, especially we ask the some advanced banks, larger banks, to provide some training services to other medium and small banks, because medium and small banks normally has not so much capacities. And the third one is that there's some incentive driven, some incentive driven by internal incentives driven by banks in themselves. For the past more than 10 years, because the quality of the green lendings is much better than the ordinary loans. So the banks themselves have strong commitment to have more green taxonomy, green lendings, because they could improve their the assets quality. The fourth is that the central bank several years ago, about 2 or 3 years ago, the People's Bank of China, the Central Bank of China, has developed some carbon emission reduction policy tools. The tools work like this: that if a bank provides some loans, green loans, to the stakeholders, to the enterprise, then with the verification of the central bank, they can get the commercial bank can get on lending from the central bank with the favorite interest rate. The interest rate is about 200 basic points lower than the market interest rate. So they're very strong incentives. The last one is that you see in China we have the many big banks are the larger banks, state-owned. Many larger banks are state-owned banks. Every year they have to get some auditing. They have to get some auditing from the national authorities, national auditing authorities. The national auditing authorities usually will make some audit for the asset quality for the green lendings, whether they have correct classifications. So that could ensure the quality of the correct classifications for the green lendings, and preventing some greenwashings in China. So that's the second point I should emphasize. The third one is that I believe China can learn a lot from other countries. As the Long and Luis mentioned, Philippines, Inner Mongolia, and Colombia and other countries have developed some their own taxonomies. Especially, there's some social goals linked taxonomy. In China, we have until now a green taxonomy, basically linked to the environmental issues, like carbon emissions, like the environmental pollutions, and to some extent linked to the diversities and to the oceans. But basically, it's linked to the carbon emissions, pollutions, and forestries. So I believe that we can learn from other countries. Okay, China would like to continue its cooperation with other countries and also with FC, and we'll continue to learn from our partners. That's all. Thanks again for for having me. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ye. I think you have been a really important spokesperson in SBFN for many years since we were founded. And I think what you've brought to our approach in terms of developing common tools for sustainable finance is these very practical elements in terms of how do you make them work, working with banks, working with other ministries, really designing something that's going to be effective and that will achieve what you're trying to do at a national level, while also learning. And I think you've been you've participated in and led a lot of the knowledge exchange between China and other countries. So thank you so much, and it's a real pleasure to have you on the webinar today. And we hope you'll stay, and maybe there might be some follow-up on questions. But I'd like to now hand over to Fiona. So Fiona Stewart is going to take us through the panel discussions where we'll hear some of the more recent developments from our practitioners and speakers that are very active in this space. So Fiona, over to you.
Thank you so much, Louise. And Mr. Yi, I do hope you'll stay around because you've already answered several of the questions in the chat, and that was super interesting. And I think leads us, you've already started this looking back and looking forward. I think China shows extremely well what was the driver of where you came from, and then how you're now applying the taxonomy. It's a super interesting story. So we'll have some more of those. And I think it's actually a really, really good point to have this discussion. Wrong, Louise, I was at a great SBFM IFC event at the end of last year with the inimitable Rachel Kite. And Rachel was talking about we're being at this regulatory tipping point globally. We've had all these 1,000 flowers blooming of voluntary initiatives around the world, but now they're starting to get hardwired into sort of mandatory regulation. So this theme that Louise is saying, this interoperability, which is impossible to say, but incredibly important, really is something I think we all collectively need to think about. And it's a very collective space. So great to hear. And I'm already a huge fan of the toolkit, by the way. So all the toolkit geeks on the call will love it. There's like all these gems in there. So it really is it's a really interesting resource to look at. But as we're talking about stories, let's talk through some of the colleagues we have today who've been working on many countries on this issue. I'm going to start with Beng from the Philippines, because you're the new kids on the block. You've just been gone through all this process and just launched your taxonomy. So it'd be really interesting to hear from you. You know, what did you learn from the other SBFN members? You actually had the the luxury in some ways of having a lot of material and experience out there. So what did you learn that really informed your super interesting, the new taxonomy that you've just come out with? What did you learn from others?
Thank you, Fiona. Hello. I hope you can hear me clearly. Hello. Again, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. And thank you to SBFN for inviting the BSP and for the opportunity to share our experience relative to the taxonomy development. I would say, and I would agree with Mr. Yi, that the journey is not smooth. There were bumps and humps along the way. So let me just share some 3 points of what we have learned along the journey. So first, we have to take a pause and reassess our policy priorities. It may be recalled that the BSP has released series of regulations starting April 2020. So banks were actually requesting for briefings, leveling of regulatory expectations of our issued regulations. So we're focusing then at the risk management side for banks for them to equip themselves so they could properly manage their exposures to the environmental and social risks. And by doing so, we hope that they could appreciate the process, and from there they could see the opportunities of financing or engaging in financing sustainable projects. And we see that this is where the taxonomy will also come into play. So that is how we design the flow of our policy priorities. Then second, we are mindful of the state of readiness of the industry. Louis shared earlier that there's no doubt on the use of taxonomy. We're also glad that the industry welcomes the taxonomy, but we also have to check on the capacity of all the parties involved in the industry. So internally at the BSP, we have to assess our capacity to develop the taxonomy, even if we are a member of the ASEAN Taxonomy Board Working Group in 2021. So I must say that we've benefited from the technical support from the World Bank team and the IFC. The discussions with the team have been so very helpful in understanding the development considerations and process. Also, even if we haven't developed the taxonomy, we have already started engaging the industry, our supervised entities. So that actually served as a signaling effort of the forthcoming taxonomy. So they have been constantly engaged all throughout the process, before the development, during the consultation period, and even this forthcoming. And even during this implementation stage, where we will be working closely with them. So, and at the time, we also underscore to them that the taxonomy will be and is a living document. So it will definitely be updated as necessary to be abreast of the developments and also the changes in the national climate priorities. Second, we are also thankful, as Fiona said, we have the luxury. We benefited from existing coordination mechanisms, which we can use for the taxonomy development. So first, we leverage on the existing collaborative arrangements, such as the Green Force, or this is an interagency technical working group composed of 18 government agencies led by the Department of Finance. So this Green Force developed actually the Sustainable Finance Roadmap, which serves as the anchor of the taxonomy. So the operationalization of the roadmap was carried out by the Financial Sector Forum. So the Financial Sector Forum, or what we call the FSF, this is a voluntary body comprised of the financial sector regulators, the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, the Securities and Exchange Commission, and the Insurance Commission. At the FSF, there's a dedicated team on the taxonomy that works on the taxonomy development, again with the technical support of the World Bank team. So we leverage on those existing coordination mechanism. And lastly, this is what I've been mentioned earlier, that we benefited also from the existing documents and strategies, such as the regional taxonomy. The ASEAN taxonomy is already out at the time that we were developing the taxonomy. So we consider this in our development process together with the climate priorities of the national government in terms of the priority sectors and also the climate objectives. So all of this have been considered in our local taxonomy. So it is indeed important that the local taxonomy is consistent with the country's policies and targets and ensures interoperability with the regional taxonomy to the extent visible. I'll stop here, Fiona. Thank you.
But you also, I think it's also interesting, Beng, that we, as Louise was talking about the trends of the social side, the inclusion, and you've been targeting, I think, SMEs. There's an SME angle in your taxonomy. Why did you include that, and how are you including that new sort of element, that new trend as part of your taxonomy?
Okay. So hello. So we reviewed the taxonomies that are out there. We note of the different objectives, focus on environment, some focus only on climate, some contribute to sustainable development goals, but there is no specific taxonomy that touch on the SMEs. So we do not want to, we're mindful of the potential unintended consequences. We do not want banks to de-risk or to terminate the financing to sectors that are exposed to high environmental and social risks. So we do not want them to impose high interest rate, for instance, for MSMEs, because this will affect indeed the supply chain or the flow of economic activities in the country. So we deliberately dedicated a separate section in our taxonomy for MSMEs. This is to highlight that they are considered in the sustainable financing, given their stature are significant source of revenue and employment in the country. So the assessment process for MSMEs activities is simplified under the Sustainable Finance Taxonomy Guidelines of the Philippines. Actually, we made reference to the IFC Sustainable Finance Guide for MSME. So we made reference to the activities that are provided there. So again, the taxonomy is a living document, and we hope to improve the assessment and the classification process as we go live with the implementation period. So we will be working closely with the industry in refining this approach. Thank you.
That's totally music to my ears. It's something we've been a broken record about, as you say, these unintended consequences, that all the good intentions that you could actually push funds in the direction that we don't necessarily will support our development. So it's really, really good to hear that you've got an interesting mechanism for that. And we're going to kind of come back to you in a couple of years' time to hear about how it's going, definitely, if you start to implement. But talking of lessons, let me come to Maiko from GIZ, who's been a fantastic partner, and you guys have been, leading a lot of sustainable development work around the world, but particularly on the taxonomies. You really have been at the front end of this in Europe, but also in a lot of emerging markets. So I'm really interested to hear about this theme is coming up of the international trends and then the local context. What have you learned? What has your team learned from how we get this right and how we get the local context and emerging markets really reflected properly?
First of all, thanks, Fiona, for the very kind introduction. And thanks to SBFN colleagues for the opportunity to join today's panel. Congratulations on this brilliant SBFN toolkit, which I think has really become an incredibly rich and useful resource. And I can only join Rong and Louise in saying that this collaboration between GIZ and IFC has been a very fruitful one so far. On GIZ, those who don't know GIZ, just 2 sentences. GIZ is the German Technical Assistance Agency with more than 25,000 staff. We are active in more than 120 countries worldwide, supporting public and private partners on their sustainable development journey. We are not a bank, so our key expertise is in technical assistance and capacity building. This is what we do. Now, sustainable finance is a key area of our work. As you just said, we support partners in their ambition to make financial systems more sustainable by design. And this happens when sustainability is really built into the regulatory and policy framework of a country. Now, taxonomies are an important building block for greening financial systems, alongside other building blocks such as disclosure standards, product standards, prudential regulation, and others. And just to say, these systemic reforms, and I think it has come through the various contributions, is a long-term, it takes a long time to develop and eventually become market practice. And so GIZ does take a long-term perspective in working with governments, regulators, and central banks and the private sector. Now, this applies very much to taxonomy development. Developing a taxonomy is both a highly technical task and also a formidably complex multi-stakeholder process with so many parties involved. GIZ has been involved in developing taxonomies in a number of countries. These include Rwanda currently, Peru, Senegal, Vietnam, ASEAN, Mexico, Brazil, Indonesia, all in different capacities. And our support typically covers the whole spectrum of activities, from initial awareness raising, reflecting with partners on the key design features of their taxonomies, sector prioritization, advising on appropriate governance structures, which is so key for the whole process to bear fruit. Developing the list of economic activities and technical screening criteria, all the way to piloting the taxonomy and building capacity for effective use. Now, when you ask about what lessons have we learned, of course, there are so many, and a lot of them are reflected in the toolkit, actually. Let me just share 4 key insights. The first one is that taxonomies really work best when they're embedded deeply into a country's policy and regulatory environment. And from our experience, it is advisable to really define the ambition for putting the taxonomy to use very early on in the process. And that requires some tedious analysis of the existing policy environment, and you have to do it in each country. But it really pays off in the end. And for example, in Rwanda, and I'm mentioning Rwanda maybe a couple of times as we're very actively supporting the government there, and the taxonomy team is just there as we speak. So in Rwanda, we have analyzed the short, medium, and long-term measures to foster implementation of the taxonomy. And these measures are, of course, contextualized, taking into account the existing regulatory and policy frameworks and links to other sustainability initiatives. So that's one. The second observation is that putting taxonomies to good use requires very strong ownership among those organizations that shape the policy environment. You can do all the analysis, but once the taxonomy is there, it really needs to be embedded in a number of legal documents and practices. And so those organizations shaping the policy environment need to forge the links between the taxonomies and the disclosure regulations, the financial product guidelines, the public procurement guidelines, green budget tagging initiatives, and all the other uses that you'll find in the toolkit. A third point, and you'll not be surprised to hear that from GIZ, but building capacity for effective implementation is really key, both at the very outset and in the implementation phase. And I can't stress this enough. The key concepts and the purpose of the taxonomy needs to be known by the public sector stakeholders and the entire market. And that's why broad awareness-raising campaigns are required. Also, as Mr. Yi just pointed out, the incentives are quite important. A taxonomy need not only be a reporting requirement, but it can indeed have benefits like improving the quality of your portfolio as a bank. Now, for this massive initial capacity, building tools like the taxonomy e-learning, in our view, are really key to reach large scale. But then, of course, that needs to be complemented by a much more tailored and in-depth advisory. And fourth, to finish on those four elements, interoperability is, in my view, becoming a key concern. We've seen the map with so many taxonomies being developed. And of course, most countries are seeking to align with international good practice and maximize interoperability. GIZ, IFC, World Bank, the G20, of course, we're all encouraging alignment approaches. However, there's no IFRS for taxonomies. And in my view, we need global mechanisms to assess the interoperability, to measure the interoperability, to inform investors, and to support stronger alignment and reduce fragmentation. And I'll stop here.
Super interesting. I'm going to be a bit controversial, a bit provocative. I think you're absolutely right, because one of the things we're hearing at the moment is everyone wants a taxonomy. Everyone's woken up and all countries want one. They don't always know why. Why do you want one? I think it's not, I think sometimes is the case. It's got a bit trendy. So I think to be a little bit provocative, I think you're absolutely right. We have to step back and say, right at the start, why are you doing this? And otherwise, we don't want this ending up on a shelf. So I think, you have extremely good experience of that. Do you agree with the trends that Louise has pulled out, by the way? Do you see the social, the transition? Are those the sort of trends that you're hearing in the work that you're doing, or are there other ones that we maybe haven't picked up on yet in this discussion?
I think I fully agree with the trends that Louise pointed out. And I think later on we also get to discuss a few more of those trends. So for now, I think nothing to add to that list. Yeah,
good. We're on the right track. And partly we're on the right track because of CBI, who started us off on all of this track. And I think actually, Bridget, it's really interesting to hear I think one of the themes that's coming out exactly is this usage of taxonomy. So the fact that it was the climate bonds initiative, you guys were the green bond market leaders who actually then have been leaders in this taxonomy work, I think it's super interesting. So in all the great work that you've been doing, I know I'm here in Thailand, you guys have been working on the new Thai taxonomy, you've been very involved in here, for example. What's the sort of secret sauce that you've been sort of hearing that really makes these work, that makes them, as Makayo is saying, that makes the take up, as Chinese colleagues are saying, that really begin to sort of drive these financial flows, the climate flows, which is what your organization is all about. What's the sort of key pieces to make that work in countries?
Thanks, Fiona, and thanks again for having me, and and congratulations on the toolkit as well from my side. I wish I knew what the secret sauce was. I think if I did, I'd be sunning myself on a beach somewhere maybe. But I think from our perspective, and really a lot of Makayo's points that he picked up is exactly what I had jotted down as some of the kind of key lessons that we have learned from this process. And I think that kind of some of the special sauce is really kind of recognizing that taxonomies and the development process and the implementation process is really this kind of constant balancing act, and recognizing that and then figuring out, okay, so how are we going to balance these things? So, you know, balancing, Louise mentioned time, you know, speeding up the process of development. And Makayo mentioned the kind of tedious analysis and groundwork that's needed. And that's a balancing act, right? If you don't do that groundwork and get everybody on board, do that underlying analysis, make sure, as you said, Fiona, we really understand why we're doing this. And I think, you know, there's certainly earlier taxonomies where probably, you know, if I'm 100% honest, maybe that wasn't fully thought through. What is the objective? Do we want to facilitate international capital flows? Are we just trying to regulate a green bond market? Are we trying to improve corporate disclosures, etc., etc.? So what do we really want to get out of that? And then that can really help us to juggle this balancing act, you know, between usability and rigor, between kind of local applicability and international interoperability. So these things kind of come up all the time around these things that we kind of have to balance, but really doing a lot of that groundwork up front and making sure why we want to do this can then enable us and enable country developers to start thinking through and setting those boundaries to say, okay, for us, the most important thing is attracting capital flows. Therefore, when it comes to that balance between interoperability and local applicability, we're really going to tip the scales a little bit more up towards the interoperability side. And somebody else might say, no, we have plenty of local capital available within pension funds. So what we want to do is kind of strengthen that rigor. Okay, so let's tip the scales a bit again to that sort of local applicability, etc. So I think that's been something that we have learned. We certainly haven't perfected. I wish we had. We've been involved in many different taxonomies, you know, from Singapore, from Hong Kong, EU, Mexico, Australia. So in lots of different types of markets. And really, you know, while our role has been primarily technical, you know, we've also, there's a very blurred line between the taxonomy as a technical tool, as Makayo mentioned, as a policy tool, as a kind of governance structure, as a tool for the financial market. So these, and as a rule set, right, which governs who uses this and for what. So I think that is really where we've seen the beginnings of success, because I think we are still at quite early days. You know, we've put these taxonomies that have been developed, but the implementation side, we're still really learning as we go. But I think through those early days, kind of understanding what we need the technical tool for, and then as Makayo mentioned, kind of embedding this as seeing it not just as a technical tool, not just as a technical building block, but then also really embedding it throughout the kind of financial system and policy and regulation. So I think for us is really trying to get that balancing act right is really part of the special sauce, and that just requires a lot of different conversations, a lot of stakeholders, and ensuring that kind of real buy-in at a local level and ownership, which is not a thing that you can just do with a click of your fingers. You know, that really takes quite a lot of effort to ensure everybody's on board, and can be as a little tedious in trying to ensure that process. But without that, it will just sit on the shelf. So I think that's really something that we've learned along the way.
And on this theme of trends, it's interesting you're saying the idea of not just mandatory, but the verification side of things, which you again have been very involved in on your green bond work. How do sort of taxonomies fit with this trend that we're moving? I would posit there's a trend of requiring sort of third-party verification for all of this. So again, this move from the sort of voluntary into the mandatory. How do you see the verification role, and what role that you play in that part of this story?
Yeah, that's interesting, because taxonomies in a lot of jurisdictions, and most of the jurisdictions that we work with, are not mandatory at this point in time, but will probably be used in, say, as a first port of call for the green bond market, where these established principles around verification, certification, external review are quite well trodden, right? So we've seen a lot of that. And so I think you will see a bit these things merging a little bit, and probably the green bond market is a good testing ground for that, where we already see a lot of external review. We've now got a taxonomy that's you know, governed by an aspect or agency of government, and so you'll start to see some rigor around, okay, who's actually saying you meet those rules and why. So we've had a fair bit of experience looking at that and evaluating different institutions as to what their capacity is to be able to do that. And the EU has also done quite a lot of work around the Green Bond Standard to look at the different requirements and registration requirements that will be put forward to allow kind of verification. So I think, so we definitely will see some of this, but I think as a first step, even moving back from that, and to Makayo's point about capacity, that is the real critical step to enable that, because we really don't want some international organization coming to the Philippines, charging much bigger rates and maybe not understanding the context. So we really want the local institutions to be able to do that, which requires that sort of capacity building and much better knowledge of local institutions around the taxonomy. So I think that is a kind of critical enabler to be able to then layer on top of that some verification requirements or guidelines. Probably we'll see initially guidelines around what and who, which types of organizations can verify.
Thank you. If there's please people, I'm sure there's questions popping up. Stick them in the chat, or if there's another source and I'm missing them, Louise, let me know. But please put in questions in the chat. But I want to come back to this idea of the really interesting question that came up. Is there an international green standard? Are we all moving towards an international green standard? So my provocation for you is this. I think green is black and white, but amber is grey. So is there the case you think, is green, the green bit, is that increasingly being a sort of international agreement about what the pure green bit is? Now, the transition, which I know the Philippines, you've been obviously, the ASEAN has the traffic light system, and what the transition is, that is going to be shaped by the country, I think, more. And I think there's a lot more questions about what that's going to be. But what do you guys think? Do you think there is actually a nub of what is green is developing globally, or is that even the green still going to be very locally contextualized? Bang, I don't know what you think about that, because you've obviously looked at the traffic light system within the ASEAN. Do you see the green as being quite standardized? I mean, ask that again, Beng, from the Philippines side. Do you see the green as being quite standardized and the amber as having much more debate, or is there still quite a lot of debate even within the green categorization?
Okay. In the case of our the Philippine Sustainable Finance Taxonomy guidelines, we have adopted actually the traffic light system of the ASEAN taxonomy. So a green activity, well, it should meet the climate change mitigation and adaptation objectives and pass the essential criteria that was actually mentioned earlier by Louise, the do no significant harm, and then if there's harm, there should be remedial measures to contain that harm, and the entity also should be compliant with the minimum social safeguards. But in our case, given also the comments that we have received from the industry, we have allowed a longer time to remediate the significant harm. But given that treatment, we will require an independent third-party verification. So it's one of the areas that we have tweaked in our guidelines as compared to the ASEAN taxonomy.
That's interesting. Again, the verification coming up. That's very interesting. Okay, Bridget, what do you think?
Although the verification is, in general, it's not yet that mandatory, except for that longer remediation period.
Yes, interesting. As you say, there's an interesting local variation that you've put in there for your context. What do you guys think in the countries that you've seen? Do you think there is standardization across the green, or is that also still up for debate?
I mean, I think in my view, I think your hypothesis is broadly correct, but I would maybe make it a little more nuanced than that. So if we think about, at least in our definition, and remember the line between green and transition is a little hazy, right? Because often when we're talking about what is green, we mean in line with the Paris Agreement, which doesn't mean zero carbon today, right? So it means sort of tracking on a trajectory. So defining what that trajectory is and thinking about what is green is a bit challenging. So I think how I might nuance your hypothesis is in certain sectors and in kind of easier hanging fruit like renewable energy and energy efficiency and potentially even in buildings, yes, that there's probably some quite good consensus. But when it comes to hard to abate sectors, that's when it gets a bit more challenging. And partly to your point about local and kind of differentiation, the scientific evidence, and we know that the G20 have put forward principles to say science-based taxonomies, we all say that, but the scientific evidence for how you take an industry pathway and then divvy it up to kind of regional or even country based is very challenging, and it's not exact, right? It's not absolute. So I think that's where we see some differences and a difficulty for investors to assess is this an accurate read of the global science and taking it into a local context, or is that it altogether not going to align with the Paris Agreement, etc.? So I think that's where, in my view, where we see a little bit of differentiation still with that sort of, I like to think of it as kind of green transition area.
Okay, I'm sure you have thoughts.
Yeah, actually, not so much to add to what Bridget just said. I think I would agree there's an emerging global consensus in a few sectors, especially in the energy sector. But even there's a huge debate about nuclear, for example, nuclear and gas. And then, of course, there's lots of national flavor. So for just a tiny example from Rwanda, it is the first taxonomy that is going to, or that includes biomass cook stoves, reflecting the need in Rwanda to move away from the traditional fuel-based cooking, which of course has negative effects on deforestation and health. So these is maybe a very small example, but that shows that even if there's an area of consensus, there's lots of national examples going around that may or may not be relevant in some countries.
And the other big elephant, if you like, it sounds like a mouse at first, but it's actually an elephant, is the whole do no significant harm. I mean, on the first thing you think, well, that's kind of obvious. Yes, do no significant harm. It's good that that's part of a taxonomy. We want that there. But what I'm hearing is it's actually being quite a big, it's not just a little issue, it's actually quite a big road bump in several countries. This is really proving extremely hard to implement. So I'm interested how you in the Philippines are sort of, I'm sure you've heard this from some of the people that you've been consulting with. So how are you making sure you've been very, very strongly, obviously, it's interesting that your banks, by the way, are asking for the taxonomy. That's really interesting to hear that the sector's asking for it. But how are you going to make sure that the do no significant harm part is really implementable? And again, from Europe, I know this has been a sort of a big question in Europe. South Africa, I think actually in your home country, it's also been a question, Bridget. So how do we get around that? How do we make sure that this is a wind that's behind us and not in front of us on the whole safeguard question?
Actually, Fiona, I didn't know the correct answer to that, but I would say that since we just issued the regulations in February, we are actually we have already started engaging the banking industry for the first on the conduct of workshop. So this is actually a venue for us, our supervised entities and direct the BSP to understand the implementation challenges, the operational concerns of banks on how are we going to implement smoothly this essential criteria. So I guess one step at a time. I do not know the answer yet to that, but we hope that in undertaking this pilot testing, we'll be able to address this concerns around the do no significant harm as well. Thank you.
What about a European perspective? What have you been hearing about this as a potential roadblock?
Yeah, I'd say the assessment is correct. Do no significant harm really poses one of the key usability challenges. But we also see innovation occurring in this space. So it's one way of sort of introducing a shades of green approach to this is using a remedial action plan on do no significant harm. What that means is that entities are being allowed to classify their projects as taxonomy aligned if they meet the technical screening criteria, but they're unable to meet the do no significant harm. But to get that approval, they would have to develop a remedial action plan showing how they will meet the do no significant harm over a period of time, say 3 years. This allows time for entities to mature and grow momentum for green finance, and sort of enables the market, even in the presence of a do no significant harm criterion. That's a proposal that's being discussed in Rwanda at the time.
Very interesting.
Some of the other kind of proposals that have come up is, you know, in the EU, we've seen obviously do no significant harm. It's not a principle, right? It's a set of criteria, right? It's not a, you can't abide by the spirit, you have to abide by the letter, right? So that's the kind of, you know, why it becomes complex, because there's a lot of different do no significant harm tests, you know, and so some of those are, you know, to Mikayo's point, for those that they can't be met, but there's also some that you can't be proven, right? So it's very difficult to prove if they can be met. So that there's a lot of work. I think that's ongoing and very much in train to kind of tighten that up, right? And that's where I think countries like the Philippines and others, the fast followers, can really learn from those lessons and go, oh, we don't want to create these tests that you actually can't prove whether you meet them or you don't. So there's quite a lot of work, and there's plenty of literature out there on that. And then I think where other countries are picking up is you know, as being already mentioned, in kind of pilot phases, or in Singapore, you've seen as a best efforts disclosure basis to begin with. So in other words, you are compliant with the taxonomy just on substantial contribution, but you have to provide some disclosure around, you know, significant harm, and that may be tightened over time. So I think we'll see some of that as well, to try and kind of get users used to the different requirements that are there, see if they're testable, is the data available, etc. And then there may be also some kind of more creative ways of proving that they're being met, different tools available in the market as sort of equivalence mechanisms, and so we'll see also how those develop.
And so I'm going to be very provocative now. So in one of the trends we're hearing this about is this broadening. So there's sort of the broadening of the scope of the taxonomies is clearly a trend that's coming through, which say from the Philippines side is obviously we're very positive. If you bring the SMEs in, that's a key part of your economy, you know, and we don't want that exclusion. That's very good. Is there a danger? Is there a risk that we go too far? Is there a danger that taxonomies become, to be very provocative, a cover or a way of governments to try and get buy-in for their policy? So is it almost, can they be used in a way, not necessarily, as you say, what they were intended for? Is there a danger if we broaden and broaden into a broader set of policies that governments then put into a taxonomy, they're using it almost as a way to get, you know, international buy-in or support, rather than thinking about what's the capital flows to the key sectors? Do you see what I mean? Do you think, are we there yet? Is there a risk that we could be going there if we keep broadening too far? How is that a danger that you see, maybe, Brigitte, or is that not really on the radar screen yet?
So I think it is a danger. I mean, I'm not so sure about kind of crowbarring various policies. Potentially that is the danger. But I think from my perspective, it's kind of the perfect being the enemy of the good. And clearly the more you try and do, sometimes the less you end up doing, right? So the more perfect you try and be, the less you end up kind of being targeted and channeling capital flows. So yeah, I think that is a risk. And so for me, a lot of this comes down to, and I think some more work probably needs to go into this, on kind of what is material, what are the really material issues for that particular sector. And, you know, biodiversity might not be one of them, then let's not worry, right? Let's really kind of focus in on the really key material issues. Now, I don't mean to highlight biodiversity. I'm sure biodiversity has very broad applicable range to a lot of different sectors, but you see what I mean? Let's not get bogged down in trying to be perfect when we really need to be quite targeted. And I think as a, you know, on the other side of that, there's some issues that you can't avoid. You know, I'm doing a lot of work at the moment on critical raw materials and critical minerals. And for those, focusing entirely on climate change is kind of pointless, right? Because you've got these extreme pollution and social issues, which 100% need to be addressed probably as a priority, right? So really kind of thinking about what is really material and kind of, I think there's probably a lack of framework for assessing that. But if the more we broaden, the more we really need to kind of tighten our understanding of, you know, in what circumstances do you need to kind of broaden to different objectives and try and meet other types of criteria.
Michaela, what do you think? Is there a risk that we go too broad? Do you think we need to walk before we run in terms of keeping the focus clean on the climate?
Yes, I would agree that we need to walk before we run, and I think that's one of the lessons that have emerged from the EU, which has parked the social taxonomy, just because the green taxonomy turned out to be so much more complex and needed to be digested, and that's why I'm not really concerned on this front. Taxonomies are so complex to develop. I can see the temptation, but then, you know, going through that process to steer capital into politically desired sectors or purposes is maybe not as attractive. And even if it happens to an extent, as long as the taxonomies are science-based, yeah, I'm not too worried. We're not talking about coal and gas. We're talking about positive purposes in terms of supporting sustainable development, such as focusing on social topics, focusing on biodiversity, even transition activities. So I'm not as concerned.
And just to finish, in terms of other sort of positive lessons you might have learned from where we can see the evidence of this, to say everyone now wants a taxonomy, where are we seeing it actually working? So I thought the China example was a very interesting one, that we actually sort of starting to get some proof that the green loans have a lower non-performing loan rate than the vanilla, which is super interesting. We're looking at this. We've got a paper coming out shortly, actually, about how central banks are starting to try and, you know, enable and encourage climate finance, but they need to be very careful that they don't lose their core financial stability focus. So there's a balance there between the more evidence that we can have of this positive outcomes, I think, is really important. So any other examples that you've seen where we're really starting to see this evidence and this traction of taxonomies starting to really flow through to the ultimate goals of driving capital to where we really need it for Paris and SDGs?
I'll try and kick off. I think we are still a bit early days. You know, if you think about a lot of the different taxonomies that Louise mentioned and some of the 47 guidelines, a lot of I don't know what the stats are, but probably I would say quite a lot more than half have come out in the last 18 months, right? So I think we're still fairly early days in terms of the implementation and kind of seeing the flow through, but maybe kind of jumping back a step. You know, in the green bond market, we regularly see what we call greeniums, you know, so basically improved cost of capital for green deals. which are then also often linked to taxonomy. So I think that is where we have seen that working and that kind of flowing through. What we're not yet able to untangle at this point is a sort of quality premium. Is the green bond that's meeting a local taxonomy getting a more of a greenium, or a greenium and the other one not? That's a little hard to. It's hard enough just to do the greenium work, and then disentangling that brings in quite a little bit more of a complicated factor. But it'll be interesting to see, as data improves on that, we may be able to measure that, and for sure that could be what we end up seeing, particularly in more regulated markets, like in the EU, where you have to comply. Well, we'll have to review the taxonomy. That's maybe a little strong, but because the green bond standard won't be mandatory. But so where those become increasingly part of the kind of architecture of the system, then I think we could see that. So it'll be interesting to see that and how that develops.
And Kai, you have a very good overview. You have a bird's eye of the whole, as you say. You really do look at the whole financial system. So where can you see the pieces of evidence that this is working coming through?
Well, I do agree that this is a very important question, but I'm not aware of any country where there's already quantitative evidence of a taxonomy showing an impact. But it's certainly something that we are looking at GIZ at assessing, also together with our partners, to monitor where we see a shift in financial flows that is measurable and that's attributable. But it's really, as Bridget says, very early stage to be saying that with certainty. The theory of change is all there, but we have yet to see the evidence.
So if there's no other questions coming through, I think that sets us up beautifully for next year's call. I think we have to come back and say, where is this evidence? We want to hear from the Philippines, your experience as you roll out in the next year, particularly on, I'd love to hear what happens with the SME side. That would be super interesting. But yes, I think let's watch this evidence, and let's come back next year and see where we've got with these trends. But thank you, everyone. Super interesting. I've certainly learned a lot and look forward to continuing the discussion. But back to you, Louise.
Thanks so much, Fiona. And just before I start to wrap things up, I just want to invite Mr. Ye, if you would like to reflect on any of the discussions, very briefly, you're very welcome to turn on your camera. But I think this has been a super interesting discussion, and one of our objectives with developing the toolkit is to gather so much of what has been learned so that we don't have to rehash that each time we have a discussion, but we can now actually move forward on how do we solve the next pieces of the puzzle. So thank you so much for these contributions. Mr. Ye, do you want to reflect briefly on any of the topics that were covered here? Okay.
Yes. About the no harm. Yeah, that's very important. But in some cases, you have to make a compromise. For example, in China, also in other developing countries, you may like to put some hydropower, which has some damage to the ecosystem to some extent, but it's good for the climate change. Yeah, so you have to make some compromise. Yeah, and also for nuclear power, it's similar situation. Yeah, yeah. Different stakeholders have different requirements. In China, for example, some people don't like the nuclear power, but some other ministry may like it. So whether it should be considered as green, you should make some compromise. Sometimes it's difficult to reach consensus on these issues. So for the social goals, yeah, in China we have another statistics which is related to the inclusive finance or financial inclusiveness. Yeah, we have special some statistics on the loans to the SMEs, to the rural areas, to the individual, low-income individuals. Yeah, we have some kind of statistics. But just for the green loans, you say in China, in most of the cases, green loans has gone to the large companies. Only few amount of the green loans has gone to the small and medium-sized companies, enterprises, SMEs. So we consider how to improve this situation. You see, so you have to make the practice. The practical situation is very complicated. So you have to change it, and you have to design different incentives to encourage or to make up for some the mistakes which is happened opposite to your original intention. The practice is very complicated. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ye. So what I'm taking from this is that we have reached a very important phase and in this journey, and in a way we're stepping into a next phase of work on the practicalities of taxonomies. And today's discussion touched on some crucial elements and also highlights why IFC has been so interested to support the development of taxonomies, and the country engagements where we've provided advisory assistance have been linked to something called the Green Bond Technical Assistance Program within IFC, and which has multiple areas of intervention to support the growth of the market for sustainability-focused finance. And there are also other climate-focused programs within IFC where investment teams are actively looking for these opportunities and working with clients in the financial sector as well as in the real sector to lower the impediments or obstacles to first-time issuance. So helping to develop sustainability frameworks, helping to get independent verification. And in that process, IFC itself has benefited from clarity around the different types of activities. So the MDB frameworks have provided that clarity. In some cases, IFC had to develop its own guidance. So for instance, biodiversity-related finance, blue finance, guidance on SME finance or SME green finance. And we do that for the market, but we also do that for IFC's own investment teams to move quickly and support the demonstration models of how to make this work in practice. And so we can expect to see more of that, and IFC's own issuances can be perhaps a leading indicator of where this market is moving. I mean, for instance, things like blue bond issuances and blue loans, biodiversity, we're seeing a lot of interest in that space. And Bridget, I know CBI is about to launch some work on resilience, and sort of adding to your taxonomy and definitions. So what I'm actually seeing in terms of engaging with IFC clients in the real sector is, yes, it's difficult for regulators to mobilize their resources to design good taxonomies, and there's a lot of consideration, but in many ways, the private sector is eager for more. And so limiting the categories up in the medium term might limit the types of sustainable finance that we could see. And existing portfolios are a challenge. So banks' existing portfolios of loans and projects, we've been working with financial institutions to see how easy it is for them to demonstrate alignment with taxonomy criteria, particularly do no significant harm. And I think, as was mentioned today, it's easy to align with technical criteria in a taxonomy. That's actually not the difficult part. So choosing an activity that fits you, aligning with the technical criteria, that is black and white. But it's the do no significant harm and the minimum social safeguards where there's kind of new expectations and not a lot of clarity sometimes on exactly what the evidence is that you would need to have. And so currently we see that as a practical impediment, not that banks, for instance, aren't managing environmental and social risk. We do see that there's still that strong embedded practice, but it's now understanding exactly what evidence from that process would support a demonstration of alignment. And that's potentially where IFC can bring more of its expertise. And then with new projects, that's probably where it's going to be easiest for new projects to align their design. And I've heard from engineers who say that this is fabulous because if they know about it up front, they can design it into the project. And if the chief financial officer knows where they want to get the financing for that project, then they make sure that they align with the technical criteria that are required. And then you have fabulous innovations in different types of activities. My favorite recent discovery was the sponge city categories in the China taxonomy, the sponginess index, and how cities can design themselves to be flood resistant by being more absorptive of water, managing water better, and that links very nicely to blue finance. So these are fabulous innovations. So we do want a core. We do want a core that everyone agrees on, particularly a core that responds to the Paris Agreement and science-based. And I think, Bridget, I think what Climate Bonds Initiative is doing is really great because you're maintaining, you're holding the flame in terms of let's keep these things tight and science-based and aligned with these objectives. But also let's open up to those areas that are maybe less controversial, but the market is ready. And just to kind of bring it to a close, there's a study that's coming out soon in South Africa related to small businesses that are, so it's an incubator that works with hundreds of small businesses to make them ready for finance from banks. And they've implemented a circular economy training program, and they track the data in terms of the performance of the businesses. What they found is a significant outperformance of the SMEs that adopted circular economy practices. Significant. They grow faster, they're more successful, and once they understand circular economy principles, it just becomes part of everything that they do. So there are a lot of wins and opportunities. Thank you again to everybody. And Rong, just to give it, in case you would like to say just a one or two remarks as we wrap up, I'm about to finish. I just want to say a huge thank you to everybody on the call. It's a pleasure to work with people who are so committed to practically solving these topics. And thanks again to GIZ for the great collaboration, and also to Fiona for the great work that the World Bank is doing in this space. And thank you to all our panelists. Rong, I just want to invite you to say one or two more words, and then we can close the webinar.
Yeah, I think, Louise, you cover all. I think one word will be partnership. I think this has been reflected very well in our conversation. It's multi-dimension of partnership, public-private, among partners on, in this call, and reflect the great partnership that we've achieved and the areas we want further to collaborate and maybe bring in more players going forward. It's a journey, just like many other initiative. I think Michael also mentioned, have to put the taxonomy into the context of the global sustainable finance policy development. And then we have a shared mission, and then it's not, we have challenges now, and, instead of block us from making progress, but actually stimulate for our further collaboration, discussion like this, I think should be happen in all the regions. So we can really level the playing field. Lessons has been learned. And here is the challenge going forward for us to work together. So really, thank you, all of you, participating in the panel and online, and really looking for a partnership going forward, and reach out to the SBFN Secretariat. I think the toolkit, I hope, actually will be a tool to stimulate more discussions. So it's not only for usage, but really discussions. Then we see the further progress collaboratively going forward. So thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.